everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'd like to talk to you about authors, habits, and hobbies. Something that I really enjoy reading about, and I noticed this about myself early in my reading life. I started to become obsessed with what authors were doing in their private time. I've been called out by my teachers and professors on falling in love with the authors rather than really reading the text. I always like to go around the text and look at the context and how it was written and why it was written and what the author was thinking and doing, and then I would just like learn more about the author in the process. So over time, I've actually read a lot of books that have to do with writers and the writing process, but also just kind of like little quirks. So for example, Mark Twain really liked to scrapbook, a book of collected butterflies, and in fact he was so good at it that there are so many collections of his butterflies at Cornell, and he also discovered a new species of butterfly which they named after him. David Foster Wallace played tennis and he was really good at it. Sylvia Plath and her father both kept bees. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was just really into fairies and the supernatural, particularly in the later years of his life, and there's a lot of writing on that. So I'm going to start with the first book that I read that kind of sparked this interest in me, and this is a book called Odd Typewriters: The Obsessive Habits and Quirky Techniques of Great Authors by Celia Blue Johnson. Sorry, I know that title is a handful, but it's just called Odd Typewriters. So in this book, we find weird little habits of authors. For example, Arthur Schiller liked to keep rotting apples in a drawer in his desk. The smell of rotting apples inspired him to write. So if he was ever feeling like he had a little bit of writer's block, he would just smell that drawer of rotting apples and it helped. Another thing we learn is that Virginia Woolf really liked to write standing up, and she also preferred to write in purple ink. Robert Frost was terrified of the dark, and so he actually wrote late at night because he couldn't cope with the darkness and he just had to stay up, but he was actually scared of the dark. Little tidbits like that are in this book, and I just loved it. I fell in love with the idea of knowing all these like really quirky bits about authors. And so I looked for the author's other books, of course, as you do. And her second book is called Dancing with Mrs Dalloway. And this is a book looking at authors and how they got some of the ideas for the books that they wrote. It goes into a lot more detail on the few authors that it chooses to focus. In this book, she actually kind of separates it in terms of how they got the idea. So one of them is when lightning strikes, so when someone just gets out of the blue an idea. So like Treasure Island, starting off with the drawing of a map, and then that sparks something. The other one is into telling, so people who come up with ideas because of storytelling contests like Frankenstein. There are many authors featured in this book, and she kind of looks at the overall, like how they came up with the idea, how they wrote it, what was noteworthy about the situation of the writing. So was somebody in love and tried to relive that and reimagine it the way they want to, like wish fulfillment? Was it because they were in a contest or a competition with somebody, and then how did they write it? How was it received? It's all very compact, but it covers all of the cool, like fun tidbits. And it is somewhat longer than a page, but it's not longer than 2.5 pages, for example. But the next work that I'm going to mention is very, very short. So this is a book called The Origins of a Story, and it looks at the inspiration behind 202 novels or published stories or novellas. And in this book, every single author featured is like one paragraph, and it just looks at that one moment of inspiration. I think I have spoken about this before on my channel briefly, but one of my favorite ones from this was the idea for Gone with the Wind, and how Margaret Mitchell used to haul books to and from the library and asking her husband to help. And he said, "Damn it, Margaret, like, you've been hauling these books so much, you might as well just write a book." And she's like, "You know what, I will." and she just started writing Gone with the Wind. Another kind of category when it comes to authors is kind of the process of writing. And in fact, the first book is actually called Process, and it's The Writing Lives of Great Authors. I have this one on Kindle as well, and in it, the author looks at several noteworthy people like Toni Morrison and the kind of writing process that they have, but that includes kind of what time do they get up in the morning, or do they write really late at night, what's their setup, how many hours do they do it for, do they write drunk and edit sober, like what's the process that it takes for the story to go from the imagination and conception to the finished product. For example, one of the more famous authors is John Steinbeck. He loved the way stories sound when they're told out loud, and he would record himself talking about the stories out loud and then played it back on a gramophone. And if it didn't hit his ear right, then he knew that he had to cut sentences or retell it or fix it. So some people had very interesting strategies when it came to how they actually wrote and their actual process. And another book on this is called Daily Rituals, Mason Curry, and this is another book of looking at the little details in the rituals that authors have when it came to writing, and how some of them stuck by a word limit, like 5,000 words a day or one short story a week. Some of the authors featured in this book are, again, Virginia Woolf and Nabokov, but also Joan Didion, Jack Kerouac, James Joyce, Junot Diaz, Philip Roth, Zadie Smith. So this is kind of looking at a little bit more recent than just the classics, but it's kind of a mix of the two. And it's funny because the more you read these, the more you start to think of authors as having kind of their own world, but they kind of feel like YouTubers almost, where you feel like you know them and you know their habits as if they were sharing a vlog of some kind. So, for example, one of the things that stood out to me in the past was learning that Faulkner wrote his novels that were very successful in less than 6 weeks. He wrote fast, but he had a night shift job as a security guard, and because he had so much time just sitting there, he spent all of that time writing, and that's how he got his work done and still got paid and had a day job. And a lot of these kind of look at the ways artists do have day jobs to, you know, make a living. Mark Twain, other than scrapbooking, also invented things. Patented like 3 or 4 inventions of his own. He was very good friends with both Tesla and Edison. You learn kind of like things about them that just keep you not only entertained, but you start to think of these authors as characters. And that's what I love most about this kind of writing, is that you just start to live with all of these authors in your head. You start to see them like your friends. I want to go on nature walks with Thoreau, go on adventures with Jack London. That would be amazing. Now, shifting a bit towards something a little bit more unusual is this book called Nabokov's Butterfly and Other Stories of Great Authors in Rare Books. So this book actually looks at some of the most rare books out there that have to do with very famous authors. So getting your hands on a first edition of The Tales of Peter Rabbit, for example. And it kind of looks at the rare books of certain authors and how you would be able to recognize them and why they are valuable. So Lolita, The Hobbit, Lord of the Flies, On the Road, The Picture of Dorian Gray, Ulysses, Sons and Lovers, The Colossus, Animal Farm, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Actually, that's a big one. So expensive. If you don't believe me, look up some of the books mentioned in here, if you read the book or not. Look up some of the things that I just listed on abebooks.com and look at highest to lowest prices, and you'll start to see how first signed editions of the first Harry Potter book can be up to $50,000, if not $100,000. And it's incredible how expensive and rare some things have become that you wouldn't even consider to be rare. Let me know if you want me to make a video on what makes books rare, because that would be fun for me to make too. Another book that I have, and we're nearing the end, I promise, is Stranger Than Fiction. So this is just a bunch of lists. But in reading about each author in the list, you kind of get a sense of something important. For example, this is the Executioner's Song. 10 writers put to death by the state. Federico Garcia Lorca. He was tortured first and then buried in an unmarked grave. 5 Russian literary exiles. I'm pretty sure you already can guess one. 5 authors with pistol passion. 10 writers who had mother issues or fixations. 15 pseudonyms of Jonathan Swift. I actually sat down and read through all the lists because it was just fun. It's like going through one of those Guinness Book of World Records. I just really enjoyed all of the lists very much, but I like that it combines some of the fiction with some biographical pieces of the authors themselves. So for example, in the cat list, there will be some things that have to do with, you know, Edgar Allan Poe liked cats, okay. But then they also look at the way he incorporated cats in his fiction sometimes, and you'll see kind of lists that cross over that fiction to non-fiction line. I really like the cover of this too. I found this in a thrift shop one day and it was such a good investment. I spent a lot of hours with this book. The last thing I'll mention is that there are some that are very author specific, of course, when they have interesting hobbies. So one of the most interesting people when it comes to hobbies is Emily Dickinson. So this book is called Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, The Plants and Places That Inspired the Iconic Poet. And in this book, we look not only at the flowers that she pressed and her relationship with plants and gardening in general, but then they also kind of weave in parts of her biography and some of her poetry, and then they'll bring in verses that kind of express some of the feelings she had towards certain plants or trees. It's absolutely gorgeous. She also used to bake a lot, and there are many recipes found in her home, and they're obviously in an archive somewhere, probably online too, where you could look at all of the recipes and the baking that she used to do. And she also used to sew her own poetry in little booklets, and that's an archive for sure, which I'll try to find and link down below. She's absolutely fascinating. I love everything about Emily Dickinson. And another one that was published also about gardening was about Beatrix Potter, and it's also about her gardening life and her relationship with cute little animals, which is what inspired her to paint them and draw them and write about them in children's books. So that's another one to look out for. Please let me know if there are some books out there on authors that I haven't heard of that kind of include their hobbies or habits. I would love to read them. So please let me know down below. And on that note, I will see you in my next video. Bye!